related to CRD programming across the country and within the regions and nationally. You can see real quickly sort of the things we're geared towards and working towards. Influence extension directors to look at some common indicators, focusing on evaluation tools. We've been doing this now for at least a couple of years. We've had a similar series of webinars and trainings at NACDEP and et cetera, and other kind of things. Excuse me, I'm suffering from a cold. Get some numeric impact indicators that we can compare and look across systems, focusing on public value, promoting learning. You can see those. And lastly, developing and delivering ongoing webinars. I'll have a little bit more to say about our upcoming webinar, but I don't want to take any more time from Greg and Nancy. Nancy is a community economics field specialist focusing excuse me.
Poking away.
This is a bad day to have a cold. Community and economic development programming and issues affecting communities across Ohio. Her areas of specialization include impact analysis, community and regional planning, BR&E, entrepreneurship, and renewable energy development. Greg serves as the Assistant Director at Ohio State University Extension in the community development area. And Greg leads field-based extension specialists and educators engaged in development of community and organizational and individual capacity to improve civic, environmental, and economic conditions in Ohio. That's a mouthful. I'll let you guys go from there.
Oh, poor Walt.
Good job, Walt.
I'm going to mute myself so I don't cause trouble.
Thank you, Walt. I'm going to share our screen now, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We want to try to make the most of the time that we have together, and hopefully we know, given your busy schedules, that there's umpteen other things you could be focusing on today. So our goal is to hopefully stimulate some thought and leave you in a little better place than you were before when you started here with us today. One thing, when Walt first asked me if I had an interest in being part of the webinar series and talking about the economic impact of programs, I immediately thought of a colleague, Nancy Bowen here. Nancy's done a lot of work in this area too. And the more we worked on this, the more I realized what I knew was just a little bit, and Nancy knew more. And I'm hoping that Nancy picked up a little bit from me in the conversations that we've had in preparing for today. And my point here is that I think we're probably all working in some way in trying to estimate the economic impact of the extension work that we do, programs, the outreach programs that we're a part of. And so one thing that I've concluded, and we'll talk about this more here in our short time, is that there's a whole lot more we could be doing here. And I think it's fantastic that the indicators group is one, it exists, and two, it's talking about these kinds of things. And so I'm hopeful that as a result of today's conversation, we can kind of move the needle a little bit as far as what we can do in this area. So one thing that we didn't want to neglect is the experience that you all have individually in the work that you've done, and realizing that we've got as many folks online that we have. It may be difficult. I think maybe Nancy and I were maybe a little bit naive in thinking that there might be a half a dozen folks that would tune in today. And so we envisioned a small group discussion, which I think could be a little bit difficult given the fact that we've got over 50 people signed on here. But one thing that, at a minimum, I think it would be helpful if you could just take a moment and really reflect on the work that you have done in estimating economic impact of programming. And so each situation that you've probably tried this is unique, and so that the context varies. The methods that you've tried most likely have varied, and as well as the challenges that have been presented, I'm sure, have varied as well. And so if you take a moment and just think to yourself about what one of the examples that come right to the forefront of your mind. If you're interested in sharing that, we might take a minute or two just to kind of throw out those thoughts. If you have them, we'll take just a second here to see if you might want to volunteer.
Thought about these things very broadly within that context, and I think that we've done a lot of kind of the low-hanging fruit into what you can gather in terms of economic data, in terms of grants leveraged and businesses started and jobs created and those sort of things. But it's the other indicators and extension that I think are really interesting too. And, you know, there's kind of this myth that, you know, we can't really collect economic data in 4-H and FCS, or it gets really hard. It's much easier in ag. I'm not sure either of those are necessarily true. So I see the challenges as like as a system. I'm not the evaluator, I should say. I'm the program leader for CRD, but we vacillate between just collecting, you know, monetizing volunteer hours contributed to trying to get really hard data that's not attainable, so it maybe just be attainable for specialized or grant-funded programs.
Fantastic, thank you. I noticed we've got some folks sharing some thoughts in the chat window too. That's fantastic. The kinds of things that I'm seeing there, you're probably noticing as well. What does it look like in terms of volunteer data? We know there's an annual calculation as far as the value of their time. That's definitely handy. We work a lot in terms of programmatic impact on potential taxes, and actually Nancy's got some examples that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So I'm glad you're thinking. It sounds like we're all kind of in the same place when it comes to the experiences that we've had and the challenges that we've faced and the methods that we've tried. So one of the things, just real quickly, it wouldn't be an extension program if we didn't start out with what we hope to achieve. And so as Walt had shared earlier, really we want to just kind of give you an overview of some of the approaches that are out there. Nancy spent a lot of time with IMPLAN here in recent years, and in prior years I've had some IMPLAN experience too. We can talk a little bit about IMPLAN as a tool, how it's been used, and then some of the things that we've learned not only from the literature, but also things that we've learned firsthand, and then hopefully we have a little bit of time at the end where we can discuss. So one of the things that I did right away, I said, well, let's take a look at JOE, and you'll see if you've ever spent some time in this area in the Journal of Extension, there's actually 2008, O'Neill spent some time and described 5 tools, and then I think I saw Dave Scheidler on this call, and I know Dave was part of a team, Kirk, and I can't remember, Dave, who your other collaborator was, but you really spent some time in the commentary section of JOE talking about input-output modeling and the use of IMPLAN. So we'll definitely talk more, and I'm glad you're here. What I want to do is jump right into these tools. And so one of the tools that O'Neill talked about is actually surveying the folks that are part of our programs. And so I know in most cases we do some sort of teaching evaluation. We also do program evaluations, whether it's at the end of the program, it might be at the end of a program year. One of the things when in a previous position, I gave statewide leadership to our business retention and expansion program, and I would do an annual survey to all program participants, and I would ask questions like the ones that you see here on the screen. So, for example, you know, dear program participant, as a result of board meeting strategies employed, how many fewer hours per year are spent in board meetings? And so, if you've seen that O'Neill article in JOE, she really talks about these tools in the context of health education, and I'm thinking to myself, well, as a CD person and working with other CD folks, I wanted to use a CD example. And so I thought, you know, one of the things that we typically do in community development is boardsmanship, right? And so we talk about how to make the most of the time that we spend together as board members. And so in this case, you could actually ask folks We had an actual program. It was focused on these particular boardsmanship and meeting management strategies, in the hopes that you've actually employed some of these strategies. Ultimately, then what in terms of hours as a board member can you document in terms of savings? So another colleague, you may know, Eric Romick from Ohio, is very focused on energy education. He's actually asked this question that you see on the screen. For example, how much have you saved in dollars resulting from the decision to install on-site solar generation equipment on your farm? And so that's one of the outcomes of the programming effort that Eric leads. And so asking flat out the participants, what is the impact of the effort? That's one tool. So, and Nance, jump in if there's something that you want to add.
I have an example that
Sure.
follows along that line later on, but several articles that we found, and Joe really do touch on a variety of different ways to use IMPLAN specifically to basically estimate programming, and that's one way to. But sometimes, in order to use IMPLAN, you have to start with a survey of your participants in order to get that raw data that you use to input into IMPLAN.
Right.
So.
Good point. So a second tool that O'Neill talked about was actually doing a calculation of the time value of money. And so again, thinking about the boardsmanship training programming example, to put that in context for this tool, you could actually estimate the dollar value of volunteer hours saved, and saying then, in essence, well, the value of these hours, or the dollar hours over time, actually could be invested somewhere else. So for example, rather than spend 20 hours per year in a monthly board meeting over the course of that year, if I could spend 10, those 10 hours saved actually could be invested today, definitely not in a board meeting, right? Rather instead with family or with a different committee or a different organization. So that would be a second tool. A third one is actually extrapolation using published data. And so again, in her article, she talked about using data related to body mass index and weight. And to put this in the context of a typical community development program, again, the effective meeting strategies approach, we could say to ourselves, well, given that, if you look at the quote there, in the US, the estimated waste is over 200 billion in lost time and wasted talent. Now that we've probably been in some meetings where we feel like we've lost that kind of money. I'm not sure 200 billion, but the point here is that let's say, for example, that we can find published research that actually puts a dollar value on organized meeting time. And so if we can say to ourselves, as a result of this program, the effective meeting strategies that have been implemented have actually saved a dollar amount, right? And so it's building on the previous two tools. And so here's an example of how I've used this in the past as it relates to business retention expansion programming. Finding an average private sector wage in Ohio, again, this is published figures, and knowing that as a result of the annual survey with the business retention expansion program participants in Ohio, that we had 3,414 jobs that were either created or retained. I could calculate then the wages associated with those jobs, and then from that, using published data, also estimate the dollars in terms of personal income that was generated. So again, using figures that are available that have been published and plugging those in ways that help further describe the impact of your work. And then the fourth tool that O'Neill talked about was cost-benefit analysis. And so again, kind of going back, if we know the number of hours that we invested, so think about your what's it called? The logic model. All I could think of was inputs, and then I got stuck on input output. Think about the logic model, right? And so when you think about inputs, in terms of an extension program, you're saying to yourself, well, I've got my time, I've got my support staff time, I've got the time of the program participants, I've got material costs, you know, I've got all these inputs that actually come together ideally in an effective way to create outputs that ultimately are yielding outcomes. If we know that, we can calculate the dollar value of that. And then we say, well, how much have we actually saved? Again, it goes back to understanding in the terms of the effective meeting management strategy extension program. Well, how much do we save in terms of hours as a result of this program? We figure out the dollar value of that, and then we do a simple calculation. So again, I'm feeling very optimistic. It was an amazing program. We had so much in terms of benefit, 25,000 we're estimating. And of course, we're highly effective extension professionals, so our program costs were a meager $1,000, right? So is this an ideal world or what? And so you can see there, and I apologize, I'm not sure why there's a small I in front of the 25 and 25 to 1, but the idea is that you can say, in essence, for every $1 spent to implement this boardsmanship program, for example, we're generating $25 of economic benefit. And then kind of building on that tool, we have this notion of a return on investment, or also known as ROI. And so if we're saying to ourselves, it cost $1,000 to put the program on, the benefit was $25,000, we can divide that, multiply by 100 to yield a percentage. That's a pretty darn happy percentage of 2,400%. Probably a better way to explain it is saying that after accounting for all the program cost, again, my time, all the inputs, all input cost, the boardmanship program was responsible for about $24 in net benefits for every $1 that has been invested. So I have actually seen some of that done more probably frequently in extension than probably use of the other tools aside from the survey. So now we're kind of sliding into the input-output tool as an approach. And I think at this point, I'm going to slide over to Nance.
Okay, well, like Greg said, I've had some experience with IMPLAN now, going about 5 years since I started as a field specialist. Before that time, though, I was in economic development and for a county, and I can tell you that there is definitely pressure when you're a county economic developer to show impact, and using IMPLAN was a way that we started to do that just by, okay, you know, if we have a expansion, a business retention expansion project or a new business, what does that mean for the county? That's really where I got my start in terms of economic development. But it's really evolved from there. A lot of the projects I've worked on really have evolved into more tourism related. I just last year did an interesting walleye festival event. One of my colleagues from another university worked with me on, you know, measuring exactly or estimating exactly what that particular event meant for the area. So, and it really is a broad range type of projects. Greg and I worked together on one where we looked at the impact of the ethanol industry on the state of Ohio. But when we really dug into some of the articles that were done on Joe, we realized, hey, there's been a lot more done out there than we've realized. So we came up with 5 articles that really, I think, help you see how IMPLAN can be used across the board. And in this case, it's really interesting because it's across the board in terms of estimating programmatic impacts of 4-H, ag, FCS, so across all program areas. Let's look at that first one there. It's estimating the economic impacts of the forestry industry. And in this case, the state of Oklahoma Extension wanted to look, this dates back to 1992, so this is an earlier article. They wanted to demonstrate the value of extension forestry workshops. They really wanted to show whether these workshops were making a difference in the state And if so, they wanted to learn how to improve on those workshops, maybe add to the program if it wasn't working, possibly getting rid of that approach altogether. And so what they did is, first of all, just to let you know, IMPLAN has 3 different types of inputs. You can change in production, change in employment, and change in wages. You only need one of those 3 in order to do IMPLAN modeling. So in this case, they used one input, which was they asked their workshop participants to choose a range of a value where they were telling you, this is what that workshop meant for my bottom line, and they were asked to choose a value. So then Extension took, the educators took the mean value, and they approached the IMPLAN model that way. They took that mean value, inputted it into IMPLAN, and that way they came up with the direct, indirect, and induced impacts of the workshops. So I thought that was kind of an interesting approach. Second example is here we're looking at the same type of project, only with FCS. In the University of Arizona Extension wanted to estimate the overall impact of the SNAP Ed program on the state. I'm sure someone in our audience is much more familiar with this project than I am, but in reading the article, they used what data they used in terms of input for the IMPLAN modeling was spending for the program. So they looked at the payroll spending and spending on materials and supplies for the program for the entire state. And that's the data that they used to input into IMPLAN to determine what types of results existed. They came up with close to 40 jobs, 2.3 million in income, and 6.1 million in sales, estimated direct, indirect impact on the state of Arizona. I'm sorry, indirect impact, because this is the impact from the direct input that impacted other industries in Arizona. And I'll explain the direct, indirect, and induced a little bit later. But they also said, hey, be careful not to double count. And Greg and I worked on a couple projects where, you have to make sure that the spending you're looking at is not a double counting, so that you're singling out this specific spending related to that program and not including anything else. And also to make sure that you're possibly leaning on other folks that might know a little bit more about IMPLAN, because it's an easy tool to use, but it can be a little bit, it's complicated behind the scenes, and it can be a little bit hard, I guess, to explain to your clients. So I think in some cases we think it's a good idea to lean on others. Example 3 is a youth development example. In this case, Extension was really challenged, and I think a lot of states are, to prove 4-H's worth. So what they did is they chose, and this was a county, not a state. In IMPLAN, when you're framing up a project, you look at the area. It's important to look at the area, the industry, and the inputs, and those are the 3 pieces for framing up a project. This was a county, and what they did is they took 32 livestock projects, and they were able to determine what spending occurred within those projects, and the spending did occur across industry sectors. So it became a multi-sector type of approach. And so they had to actually, instead of using one sector to input into IMPLAN, they had to use several, because they were looking at spending for feeding, spending for bedding, spending for all the variety of expenses that were related to these livestock projects. Added all those up, inputted that into IMPLAN, and they were able to come out with what that overall impact was. Next example. Now here, I don't know if anybody out there has used this. I have not. But I was really interested to read about what Fortenberry and Deller wrote about in their article in 2008. which is a model software they developed. It's kind of a spin-off from IMPLAN. And what they wanted to do was estimate the impacts of biofuel plants for a community. There was a demand out there. Communities wanted to know, what is the impact of these type of plants on my community? They needed to know this in order to decide whether they wanted to work on the recruitment of these types of plants, maybe decide on what the incentive package would be, if any. And so they came up with this input software tool that helped the community determine what the return on investment of these plants were. So apparently it was used fairly widely back then, and I don't know if it's still used or not, but I thought it looked like a very handy tool.
Real quick, Nancy, if I might.
Sure.
One thing that, if you take a look at that Fortenberry and Deller article, one thing that jumped out at me was it kind of goes along with kind of what we've been talking about, what we've learned actually in practice, is that the context matters, the way that the tool is used matters, and what I pulled out of their article was the point that, you know, they loved IMPLAN. It was a neat tool, but it still didn't work for what it was they were trying to do. And so they took bits and pieces of the data and the database itself, and they had the wherewithal and the capacity to create their own tool. So they modified. And so that just really rang true. And
back there then also, they did not have a sector for biofuels and IMPLAN. You have to pick a sector when you go in there and you're analyzing project, and if the sector isn't there, you have to make the sector up by using spending patterns. So this was their way of developing the sector in a separate software. Now this one is more near and dear to my heart. This is actually an example that I was the extension educator for the county that this was done. This study was done for. Greg and I were both involved in with Tom Blaine in writing this article. It was as a result of a catastrophic time in Van Wert County's history, where we basically lost 9% of our jobs in a period of 1 year during that 2008 recession. Van Wert County was very concentrated in the automotive industry. So, and that was one of the hardest hit industries during that time. We lost a total of 630 jobs. And of course, my board and the leadership in Van Wert County wanted to know, what's the story behind this, and what can we do to look at how to grow our economy over time. So IMPLAN really helped, because I was able, through BR&E, I was able to determine where those jobs were lost and within what businesses. I came up with that total of 630 jobs in automotive. I was able to plug that into IMPLAN to determine what that number of jobs would have meant in terms of loss in other sectors. Next slide. So you can see here, these are the eight sectors that were impacted the greatest from the impact of 630 automotive jobs lost. There was 340 jobs lost in transportation equipment, 234 in machinery manufacturing, and on and on. That just basically told us, you know, this is where our weaknesses are a little bit. Maybe this is where weaknesses and strengths. And it really forced us as a community, it really informed our programming and forced us to look more into diversification and other ways to grow and sustain our economy. Next slide. So here's our plan for growth. This is basically due to the story that we developed as a result of the IMPLAN analysis. We decided that we were going to try to grow jobs in these sectors. So there's a concerted effort now to work on gaining jobs in these areas, primarily through retention, expansion, and entrepreneurship. But that advanced manufacturing job number looks pretty big, I know. That's due to a super site that Van Wert County has that they're hoping to land a rather large manufacturer. So that's the plan. Here, just a sampling of some of the examples of projects we have done. I mentioned the Walleye Festival. One that's done really frequently, I'm probably asked every other month to do a contribution analysis for, say, a county that's looking at what does the agricultural industry mean for us, or another particular industry. Right now I'm working on one for the ethanol, updating our report actually from earlier on the ethanol industry. Or even what are the top 10 employers in my county? That's a real easy one through IMPLAN. And so I've done that many, many times. Just the components. We know that the direct impact is one of those three inputs I mentioned. But that's the industry or business or event that's immediately affected, and those numbers are the direct numbers. The indirect numbers are the suppliers or businesses that are affected as a result of that direct impact. So they are consequently either losing or gaining jobs and investment. Induced is the result of employees reduced or increased spending for employees, and in turn, they spend those monies out in the community at restaurants and retailers and such. The total of the three is the total impact. So those components are just important to understand. It's a good tool. It's an easy to use tool. I took a one-day training to learn it way back when I first started using it about 5-6 years ago. But I think it became a little easier for me and over time just by using it and by working with others who use it. So I think it's a great complement to other programs also.
I don't know if this is the right time for this question, but our colleague Mary Lucia in Missouri is asking the skill set that's necessary and the kind of training for using it. Do you want to talk about that now?
I don't know that it really requires. I mean, I think for me, I like analysis. I like working with numbers a little bit, so maybe that helps. But it's not a difficult tool to use. And I tell all of my colleagues that here in Ohio State, and I've worked with a few of them. I'm helping them out to get started with it because it's really not difficult to use. I think if you like working with numbers, you like seeing the results of the program impact work. That's a key piece right there. I do recommend the one-day training. They have a basic workshop that they put on, and I think I know they're having their very first conference coming up in March of next year, but it's on a cruise ship. But they also have workshops that take place at other times during the year that I would recommend anybody who's interested in really getting into this to take one of those workshops.
Yeah, that's a good answer, Nancy. I think, Mary, what I would add is the interest in helping to tell the story. And so, I mean, when we think about the work that we do in extension and working with communities who oftentimes struggle to understand the situation that they're in and why they're there and what they can do, if they can do anything to try to change that situation. That personally was what motivated me to partner with an ag economist here at Ohio State when I first came to campus to learn more about how to use the tool. So I think if you have that interest, you don't have to be a numbers whiz, you don't have to be an Excel whiz. But if you're interested in helping tell the story about how things are related and interrelated and how changes in one can impact so many other things, I think that's step number one.
It's the curiosity piece too. Yeah. I've got this. I'm curious about what.
And I Dave and Stacy, I couldn't agree more. There's definitely assumptions to be made, and I think that's on a slide that we have here to talk about in a moment. One of the key pieces of using IMPLAN, and I know Dave, you and colleagues talked about that in your commentary in terms of as an extension profession, if we intend to use input-output modeling and IMPLAN, I think you're absolutely right. There's opportunities to improve, and when I've done work using IMPLAN and shared it in communities, one of the things that I've always focused on is what it is, what it can do, and what it isn't, and what it doesn't do. And then I also spend time on the terminology and trying to help folks understand what these key terms mean.
we're also very careful with our reporting. We have businesses sign an agreement that says that we will release the results of the analysis one way or another, pro or con. So they have to sign that. We're interested in our integrity. We want to make sure that, you know, whatever results we come out with, those results are going to be shared. And sometimes they may not be the results that the client is looking for, and that's okay. That's not, you know, we're looking at just finding out what that number is, finding out what those results are, but we're not interested in making sure that we get it right for the client, in other words.
So the slide you see on screen now, actually, that's a snapshot of a cover page on a final report that the executive summary was probably 10 pages, and the full report probably more like 100 or more. So you can see, I think it says 2005, January 2005. Extension here in Ohio actually paid a consultant, the et.al group. You may be familiar with the et.al Foundation, to actually take a look, talk about estimating the economic impact of an extension program. They looked at all of extension. So think Big P program, Ohio State University Extension program overall. And so Nancy talked earlier about surveying folks to find data. That data can be used then to inform the input-output model when there isn't existing data that's already part of the input-output IMPLAN data set. So I can recall being asked to share figures as part of this effort. But to make a long story short, we ended up with a report, and of course in the executive summary it said this is the amount of dollars that investment in Ohio State University Extension means to the state. And so, having had some experience with input-output modeling and using IMPLAN, I was particularly interested in this report. And there were some critics that looked at this and said, well, these are dollars that would be spent by the state of Ohio anyway. So it's not as if dollars came to the state necessarily that wouldn't have been spent locally. And so I think a couple of key points there I think that need to be made. As much as we want, or we think we want, tools that are black and white, yes or no, plug in the number and there's the answer, I don't think that's how life works. And we probably all realize that. And so when we're sharing the impact of our work, it's very difficult to say, here it is, unless you're prepared for someone to argue. And if you're unwilling to realize that what you've done is really probably more art than science, right? So think back to what we talked about earlier, the different tools that O'Neill had shared. I mean, there's just all kinds of room for error there. So if I ask you, how many hours did you save in terms of your board meetings over the past year as a result of this program? There isn't anything about that that's black and white science, right? And so everything that we do, I think, when it comes to estimating the impact of our work, whether it's economic impact or otherwise, I think one thing, like I said earlier, having spent time with Nancy, talking about this and talking today with you about this, it's a goal I think we need to strive for, but I think at the same time we need to realize that it's not a black and white issue. And so one, it's more art than science. Two, the assumptions that we make. I remember when I first got into input-output work with Dave Craybill, and Dave had done some of this work, and so he kind of took me under his wing. And Dave Scheidler, I'm sure you remember Dave Craybill. He walked me through some of his early projects, and he said, he showed me the files. He said, everything you do, every assumption you make, you must document, record it, report it. Here it is. Don't lose it. So he had literally pages and pages that showed his thinking, and his thinking oftentimes changed. And when it did, he would go back in and change the modeling or the equations or the assumptions that he used. And so that's why I think we have to remember this is not science. It's definitely more art. And the more we can communicate how we got from, you know, where we started to where we concluded, that has to be. So it also made me think of a high school teacher I had. I think it was my physics teacher, and he'd give us these exams, and he would always say, show your work, right? We got to show our work. And so you couldn't just write an answer down without showing him how you arrived at the answer. He wouldn't give you credit if you didn't show the work. And even if you got the answer wrong, if you showed your work in a way that let the teacher realize that you had some idea what you were doing, you got some points. So that's another key takeaway. So I can go on and on, Nancy.
Yeah, I was thinking that this walleye festival was really interesting because they had to estimate. I mean, the analysis was very much based on the numbers of people that attended this 3-day festival, right? And so how do you estimate that number? And so that was one of the assumptions. Here's the number of overall over the 3-day festival, numbers of people that attended the festival. There was no entrance fee. So they used some videographic technology to estimate that number, but very carefully in the report, we made sure that we let people know, let the reader know that, you know, this was an estimate based on this technology. This assumption was an estimate. It could be pro, minus, or plus so many people. That's just an example.
So we have a question, Nance, about the cost of the data, and I see Dave has answered it to some degree. There's a variety of packages available, and depending on what you need. I know the state level data will give you your entire state, and that's every year the price has gone up. Yeah,
it's gone up especially since the online program came out.
We're probably close to what, $5,000 roughly,
north of that.
$5,000 to $6,000 for the most recent state level data.
And that includes right down to the zip code level now. So you don't have census tract or block groups, but you do have you have county level, and now you have the zip code level, which I think has been in place for a while. And that's kind of nice if you have a smaller study area that you're working with.
Other questions? Yeah, Mary makes a nice point too. The cost of the data is such that if, so for example, when I was part of our Ag Econ department, there was another individual that used the data for his own work, and we would alternate. I would buy 1 year, share it with him. He would buy the next year, share it with me. And as that price continues to increase, that just makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions or comments?
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Julien Kwame from University of New Hampshire. I think the real problem that we have with my new experience with extension, I'm an expert evaluator, but my experience with extension is really limited. So I'm learning from, that's why I really wanted to be at this workshop so I can understand what people do somewhere else. The real problem we have with extension is putting value to extension work. So it's not, because I know the different ideas you provide here to do economic impact, things that exist already. Probably the implant will incorporate all those things. But now, how to put a value to non-valuable outcome? This is the main and the key issue that we are mostly having with extension. I know other people have it. So I use, for me, I start doing some work like that, and what I'm trying to do is doing, instead of doing purely economic impact, I'm attempting to do social return on investment. And doing that, then I'm trying to put in narrative, a narrative way, some aspect of the work that we cannot really put value on. But you know, we all know that politicians want really to see here is the numbers. So, so I don't know how IMPLAN will help me in that matter of putting value to non-valuable outcome.
Mm-hmm. You want to try to address that?
Hello?
I'm not sure that it really works for every situation and for every. I don't see it as a universal tool for. I don't know if it has it has broad application, but I don't know that you can use it for every possible scenario. That would be my answer to that.
Yeah, I can't add much more. One thought when I heard your description, and this probably isn't a good answer either, but when I think of the local support that we have here in Ohio and the state level support that we have, I don't think it goes back to any kinds of economic impact statements that we make about our programs. I really think that it's as a result of what people see in those communities. And so when you talk about that, the social impact, the county commissioners in our state, they see it at the county fair. They see it in the communities that they live in, and these county commissioners oftentimes become state legislators, and so they know it. They know the impact, the social impact of the investment that they make, either as county commissioners or state legislators. And so I hear what you're saying, and I know it plays a huge role. How we put a dollar amount on that, I think, could be difficult.
And that's why when we approach this workshop or webinar, we wanted to look at other ways to measure impact other than IMPLAN. So we, in the beginning of the presentation, we looked at a variety of other ways to do that. But yeah, it can be a challenge.
Yes, there is a tool that I used before when I was at somewhere else. A tool that I used, I think it's made by Britain, English people, not American English, European English, and it's called Social Return on Investment. It's a tool. It's a very, very well detailed tool that to use, and when that is used, they can take into account. But the real issue again, I come back, is to try to go at the beginning. Somebody said that very clearly. You have to find literature and publication paper that talked about your issue and who put value on it. And the point comes to the point that when you cannot find the literature anything that put value on what you did, and it becomes very, very, very complex. Last 2 months, I'm struggling trying to find literature on my outcome so I can put value on it. It's a very, very big headache.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? I'm very encouraged by the number of people that have spent time on this today, and it's reminded me that this is an area that we probably all should spend a little bit more time in.
Absolutely.
I'm glad the indicators group is focused on this, so thank you. Walt, any other thoughts?
No, other than thank you guys. This has been really helpful. The other thing I was thinking about was there was some chat from Mary and talking about making sure we connect with other people in our institutions undertaking this. Are there other thoughts you have about states or extension systems getting started in all this? Are there lessons that you've learned about incorporating this into your programming and making the case for the expense of all this within your institution that we might all learn from?
We haven't specifically done that, but there is a group that's begun to be formed around IMPLAN usage and sharing approaches and projects, and so I know a couple individuals from West Virginia and Minnesota and Indiana, and I think we could definitely extend an invitation, and anybody who wants to learn more, this is a group that uses IMPLAN quite a bit, and we're working on getting it together, but we still really haven't gelled that yet. So
Walt, real quick, what I would add is our new director, Roger Rennekamp, came from Oregon State, and he will celebrate his second year here in January. And one of the things that he's really focused on here, as we talk about some of the restructuring of our state extension system, is a state level approach to program evaluation with common indicators. And so rather than have 88 separate county extension programs, we've got 88 counties, right? And so you've got multiple people in each county office. They're each doing their own thing. And when you try to wrap that all up at the end of the year for not only the federal report, but for any other sort of reporting purpose, it's pretty much a train wreck. And so what he's hoping to do is kind of rein that in and come up with something that's much flatter and more efficient in terms of reporting. So maybe a year from now, we can share something really cool with you in the group.
hey, a little shameless plug here, but as everybody knows, we're having the NACDEP conference in Cleveland next year, 2008. So hopefully
2018.
I'm sorry, did I say 2008? It was on the, sorry about that. We're not going back that far. And we're inviting IMPLAN to have to exhibit their product and show, have it there and have it available to use for anybody who attends. And they also, get them involved in some kind of presentation or panel. So any thoughts on that? Do you think that would be helpful?
I certainly do. What do you all think?
This is Dave Scheidler. I think it would be helpful to have IMPLAN there and to have them participate. I think the word of caution that I would throw out to the whole extension system is and partly to reinforce Kwame's comments earlier, IMPLAN is not a silver bullet. If you're, in fact, it is really focused on, if you're looking at supply linkages, as Nancy had talked about between the direct and indirect and induced impacts, it's really a supply chain driven model. And so if you're really talking about what are the outcomes, going to Greg's comment about logic models, if you're really focused on outcomes, IMPLAN can't help you. And I think 90% of what extension does falls into that latter category. Very few of our work focuses on those supply chain type activities. We're focused on nutrition and obesity and in terms family and consumer science or youth development or some of these other things that are much more nebulous in terms of their economic impact. And so IMPLAN is a tool, and it's got its uses and it's useful. I'm not dogging IMPLAN, but I don't think it's quite the panacea that people may want it to be. So just throw that out there.
No, that's good. That's good, Dave. Thank you. Any other closing thoughts? We want to keep you on time here.
This is Stacy. Just following up on that. I think it would be a very interesting session. Just even the initial JOE lit review that you did, kind of showing and contrasting different types of ways that people are doing evaluation, I think would be really, really insightful to a lot of people. And I know we know this and we know that information's out there. None of us take the time to really spend delving into that. So I would see that as a really important thing that you all could do at the conference that would add a lot of value and might attract, from a selfish perspective, attract some people from other disciplines to come to the conference.
Great.
Good thinking, Stace. The level of participation here, you might be right. I had mentioned to Nancy that we've gone to the trouble of putting all this together. It might make an ideal conference proposal that Nancy might submit, but imagine if we had 50 people in the room having, you know, a real face-to-face conversation about these tools and what we could do better. It really could be powerful. Yeah,
I like that idea a lot.
love your comment, Dave. We have a little bit to do with the planning here in Ohio. So any other input you have about conference planning, let us know. Do it as a workshop with a backup plan. Yep, good, Mary.
Oh, I like that. That's
All
good.
right, well, Walt, I don't want to hold you guys up. And I know
Thanks, everybody.
if it's as beautiful where you are as it is here, you probably want to get outside. So
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Greg and Nancy, very, very much.
thank you.
A couple of notes. There is the evaluation link in the chat box, and we'd appreciate if you would go to that and give us your input. We will record it. I saw a couple of notes in the chat box about recording. We will have it recorded and linked from the Southern Rural Development Center's website. And what was my other? Oh, that's it. Thank you guys very, very much. Oh, the other thing is, you saw the list early on when I shared the list of folks on the CRD indicators work group. If you don't know those folks, or even if you do, talk to them, and if you have particular ideas about other evaluation CRD related webinar topics that you'd be interested in, please communicate with us. We're in the process of planning the next year, essentially. Our next one will be around evaluating collective impact. We don't yet have a date for that, but it will be in late January or early February. So unless there are any other thoughts or considerations for the good of the order, I want to thank everyone for participating today, and certainly thanks to Greg and Nancy for putting this together. I think we've sort of teed up an ongoing discussion. I certainly hope we have.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Walt. Feel better.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all very much.
Okay.